June 4, 1943. Mexia, Texas. Gefreiter Karl Weber pressed his forehead to the warm glass of the Pullman coach and tried to steady his hands as the train sighed to a halt. He saw electric lights strung like a net across the dark, far brighter than anything he had known since the war began. Bright bulbs on porches, neon signs in shop windows, street lamps running in clean, straight lines to the end of the block. He heard music from a radio through an open doorway and smelled smoke from the locomotive mixed with cooked meat and the sweet edge of cola syrup drifting from the station kiosk. When the guards opened the doors and called the order to disembark, he expected shouts and blows, but the Americans guided the column down with clipped instructions and a pace that felt almost formal. A dock worker in a canvas cap paused, lifted a glass bottle from a wooden crate, and tipped it back until it hissed and foamed against his teeth. The label carried a looping script that Karl recognized from before the war in the big cities on the Rhine. Coca-Cola. He watched the man drink half, smile, and toss the empty into a bin, where it shattered with a quick, clean ring. He thought at once that this could not be a private product. No one could make and move so many bottles during a world war unless the state controlled it. He had eaten stale bread in Tunisia and boiled coffee from ration powder that tasted like burnt chicory. He knew what scarcity felt like. This did not look like scarcity, so he told himself the same thing he had told himself when he saw white bread in their mess hall on the dock at Oran. It is a trick. It is a show. It is what a government does when it wants prisoners to think it commands the earth. Behind the glass and the crowded platform was a larger picture that had already begun to crush that belief. The column of captured men stepping down in Mexia this Friday night was only a fragment of a stream. The month had opened with Allied control over North Africa after the surrender in Tunisia in May, where approximately 250,000 to 275,000 Axis troops laid down their arms across a widening perimeter as isolated units were counted and processed. In the summer of 1943, the United States held the capacity to move tens of thousands of prisoners by sea and rail in regular cycles. It did this while transporting ammunition, fuel, food, and aircraft in volumes measured not by cartons or pallets, but by millions of tons, hauled on 2,710 Liberty ships that rolled out of yards with methods that replaced the craft routine of peacetime with timed processes. From Norfolk through the Chesapeake to coastal convoys, docks handled daily tonnage that matched or exceeded what a major German port could move in a week, and yards could load and coal trains in minutes with automated chutes, electric pumps, and organized crews trained to stick to the minute hand. The country did not simply have factories. It had a network of electricity, track gauge, cranes, and schedules that made the site in Mexia a simple endpoint of a chain that began with a manifest in Algiers and a convoy schedule off the Virginia Capes. In such a system, a glass bottle of a sweet drink was not a signal from a ministry. It was what a distribution network could carry as easily as mail. Yet many German prisoners felt the first prick of doubt in the same place Karl felt it, in a small shock of ordinary life that seemed impossible. Karl remembered that in 1940, the blackout order had plunged the Ruhr into nights that felt older than his grandfather. He remembered his family saving ration coupons for a Sunday treat, and he remembered that before the war, Coca-Cola had opened outlets in German cities, but disappeared when trade tightened. He knew of the substitute brewed in Germany from what remained, a local drink sold under a new name that had been created because the syrup from America no longer arrived. He knew nothing then of how the German affiliate had improvised with whey and fruit pressings to keep its bottlers alive. He only knew the feeling of watching a civilian in a work cap drink a cold bottle without pause and throw it away. In that moment he felt small and he felt angry, and he told himself that only a government could afford such waste in wartime. He did what soldiers do when the ground of their belief tips under their feet. He counted details to steady his mind. He counted the steps to the platform, the slack in the handcuff chain to the man in front of him, and the distance to the line of military police with batons that stayed at their belts. He watched a boy with a cardboard tray walk up to a guard and offer him 2 bottles with a quick grin. He smelled the syrup again and looked away to the black bulk of the locomotive and the clean lines of the rail yard pulled in a fan toward the turntable beyond the freight sheds. He told himself again that this was a show, and he thought of a page in a pocket diary that he had hidden in the seam of his jacket, ready to record the day if he could keep from losing it. He thought of the capture near Mature in May, the brief heat and smoke and the shouted orders to drop weapons as British and American armor pushed in from 2 sides, and he thought of the way officers had told them that the enemy could not keep up a long advance because American industry was uncoordinated and British industry was exhausted. He remembered how he believed it. Now he looked at the floodlights, drowning the station, in clean white and the smooth-surfaced road beyond the fence, and he watched the guards move an entire column of men from train to truck in less than half an hour without raised voices. Then the truck bed shook as men climbed in, and he sat with his back to the board wall and felt the cool night air on his face. On the bench across from him, a prisoner muttered that the soda was manufactured by the army to control civilians. The others nodded. Karl nodded too. He still wanted that to be true. It was easier than the alternative. The alternative looked like an entire country built at a scale that made such bottles as common as stones in a field. The overview of that moment was measured by figures that older Americans in Mexia understood on instinct and that German prisoners learned by watching. The town sat in a state where rural electrification leaped from minority coverage before the decade to wide coverage by the early 40s, as public and private lines extended to farms, oil leases, and cotton gins. The depot stood on rails that fed into trunk lines across Texas and Oklahoma to the Midwest and the Gulf, and those rails carried freight cars that moved grain and steel and coal in sequences timed to minutes and hours. In 1943, the nation registered more than 30 million civilian automobiles, even with new production drastically cut for the war. A number that meant parking lots filled at shift changes in steel mills and aircraft plants, and meant that the cars in view at a base or a dock were not a show for prisoners, but a normal sight for working people. The same year, the Army Service Forces tracked supply in millions of rations per day and put meat, milk, and bread on tables in camps across the country with a regularity that looked unreal to men from Europe, where blackout, bomb damage, and shortages defined daily life. For German prisoners, the most important consequence of this was not simply food or light, but the fear that rose when they realized that the sweet drink in a bottle was not a state trick. It was a sign of a distribution machine that spared no thought for a crate here and a crate there because it was supplying a continent. That thought would take time to settle. On the first night, it could only come as a murmur over the clink of bottles at the station stand and the rustle of paper cups. A small sound in a broader scene where a town came to look at a train of enemy soldiers and went home after with the same calm that people bring home from a county fair. He folded his arms tight against his chest as the truck jolted forward, and then he loosened them when he remembered the heat. August in Virginia had left sweat on his skin that made his jacket feel like a weight. Texas at night felt dry and almost cool, with the air scented by creosote from the ties and a faint sweetness from the cotton bales stacked under tarps along the siding. He studied the faces of the guards and the workers who stood back from the road to let the convoy pass. Most showed little expression. A few looked on with flat curiosity. A small girl standing beside a woman in a plain dress pointed at the prisoners and then looked past them at the truck and the tarpaulin and the soldiers marching behind. No one shouted. No one jeered. A boy on a bicycle weaved near the curb and held a bottle of the same drink in one hand. He took a long pull from it, as if he had no fear of it running out. Karl felt a sudden dull hunger that surprised him. It was not hunger for meat or bread. It was hunger for certainty. In the summer haze of Tunisia, he had known exactly who he was. He had a rifle. He had sand in his mouth. He knew the enemy was a man who had to fight in the same heat. He did not understand what he saw now. He told himself again that the bottle in the boy's hand was a symbol made by a government to impress prisoners. He could believe that on a dark street. He could not believe it the next morning. The wider scene that reached that truck bed was set long before the night in Mexia. United States bottlers had spread Coca-Cola through the 30s in cities across Europe, including Germany, where the brand had grown without the language of government promotion and with a wide franchise system that depended on local partners and constant supplies of syrup. When war and trade restrictions cut the flow of syrup to Germany in 1940, the manager of the German affiliate created a new drink based on what he could procure, blending whey and fruit pressings and giving it a name born from a call to use imagination. That drink filled some of the market left behind, but never erased the memory of the older brand. German soldiers who had seen American magazines and films before the war carried an image of the bottle already outdated by scarcity at home. In the United States, the war did not eliminate the brand. The government did not need to make it. Private firms were wired into public logistics. The Army Quartermaster Corps bought food by the trainload, and quartermasters bought soft drinks in quantities that left civilians with a reduced but steady supply, while the company built filling plants near bases to serve soldiers at canteens and USO halls. In 1943, the bottling of soda for the armed forces became an organized program backed by decisions that allowed supplies to move because the War Department judged morale worth the sugar and glass and transport space. Seen from the platform at Mexia, this looked like a state program. Seen from the War Department, it was a decision to let private production piggyback on troop logistics. For captured men who had come from a command economy bent on autarky, the distinction was hard to grasp. So when bottles appeared wherever American uniforms gathered, nervous talk among prisoners made it into a nightingale of meaning. It was easier to fold the sight into a story of manipulation than to accept that the production and distribution of private companies were part of the larger river of supply. He slept only in short bursts that first night behind wire at Camp Hearn, waking whenever someone turned on a light at the end of the barrack or when a guard's voice carried across the yard. In the morning, he followed the line to the mess and took a metal tray stacked by a soldier with sergeant stripes who spoke German well enough to make jokes about the coffee. The food was plain and more than anyone could finish. The milk was cold. There was fresh bread. On a side table stood 2 metal tubs filled with ice that steamed in the warm air. Inside lay glass bottles that pressed against one another and chimed when a hand reached in. The guard flicked a hand. "Take one." Karl hesitated, and then reached down and felt the cold bite his fingers and pulled a bottle up into the light. He wiped the wet glass on his sleeve. The red circle on the label looked the same as it had in Dusseldorf before the war. He waited for the guard to add a word about the state or about the army. The guard said nothing. He pried off the cap, raised the bottle, and drank. The sugar sparked on his tongue, and the bubbles ran up into his nose. He stopped to breathe and took another drink. Men around him did the same. A few laughed with the surprised sound of boys. He heard a mutter at his back that this was how the Americans make people docile. He drank again and did not answer. He remembered a sheet in a camp display that listed the daily ration and the protective rules under the Geneva Convention that had been read to them in Norfolk. He remembered, with a small shock, the sentence that said that the United States would pay for prisoner labor and would put a portion of the pay in an account to be given to the prisoner at the end of the war. He lifted the bottle and stared at the light running through the brown glass. He asked himself if this could still be a show, and then he looked at the ice. Ice in June, packed thick as frost on a river in January, brought in by truck from a plant in town that was one of hundreds in the state. Ice to chill bottles for prisoners at breakfast. He finished the drink and set the empty in a crate marked for return. He heard the guard tell another prisoner to put the empties in the corner. The word return stuck in his mind. The bottles went out, more came back, and no one in the mess spoke of the ministry that sent them, because none had sent them. The broader frame around that breakfast included a chain of camps and branch camps across the country that multiplied in the same season that Karl took that bottle from the ice. By mid-1945, the United States held more than 370,000 German prisoners within its borders, with the total Axis prisoner count higher still, and operated more than 500 sites across 45 states. Major camps like Camp Hearn were built in months on a plan that could be repeated. Branch camps were opened near farms and mills in harvest, and then closed when the season ended. Each site layered electricity, water, kitchens, medical rooms, and classrooms on land scraped level by bulldozers and poured with concrete by crews who moved from job to job. The numbers behind this system make dry reading. They were the important thing. Millions of prisoner labor days tallied in ledgers that balanced out shortages in farm counties. Thousands of miles of rail line feeding prisoner movements that did not interrupt troop movements. Tens of thousands of letters that moved in and out of camps through a censor's hands each week. There was no need to print a soul, myth on a label and call it a state drink. Reality delivered the message without words. A prisoner who worked in a cannery in late summer saw a belt carry more tomatoes in a day than his factory had carried in a month. A prisoner who cut pulpwood in a southern forest saw trucks move logs to a paper mill where steam rose out of the roof vents day and night. In the midst of this movement, he would see a crate of glass bottles in a corner, and then see another crate the next day, because a driver made a regular stop and logged his route and timing on a clipboard. When officers from the intelligence section interviewed prisoners and recorded their remarks, they noted a steady change by winter. The talk about tricks and shows gave way to questions about numbers. How many ships? How many aircraft? How many plants? How many men? This is what defeated the tale that the brown bottle in a hand at a rail platform was a government invention. The bottle was less than a foot high. The numbers behind it reached across the horizon. He sat on the edge of his bunk after breakfast and ran his thumb along the seam of the diary hidden in the jacket. He wrote a line and then another, careful with the tiny movements that kept the pencil from tearing the page. He wrote that the Americans were clever and that they fed prisoners better than German soldiers at the front ate in the last months in Africa. He wrote that he had drunk a bottle of Coca-Cola and that he had thought the drink was a sign of a state apparatus, and that now he was not sure. At the end of the line, he added a short sentence about ice. He underlined it. Then he folded the coat and set it under the straw pillow. Down the barrack, a man was reading a notice about classes that would begin when enough names were added to a list. English, mathematics, history. A doctor in another barrack was organizing a clinic and training teams of prisoner orderlies to monitor sanitation. Karl felt less fear after the bottle. He also felt more exposed, as if the simple taste on his tongue had drawn him closer to the thing he had to see and to the thing he had to say aloud. He did not trust many men in the hut. He trusted what he could count. He could count bottles. He could count light bulbs. He could count trucks. He resolved to keep counting, and he told himself that counting was not surrender. It was the one honest habit a soldier could carry from a lost front into captivity. The overview that met that small decision was already moving ahead. The plant that filled bottles for the camp stood on a street near the center of the town and ran shifts governed by power that did not fail and by deliveries that met timetable. The sugar quota that kept output in check was managed through a ration system that reached into stores and bakeries, and the same distribution lines carried milk, bread, and powdered eggs by truck and rail to the gates of camps on a schedule. This world made room for a sweet drink at breakfast because this larger machine could afford it. That was the lesson that American officers wanted German prisoners to learn without a lecture. The officers did not say this out loud. They issued the rules of the convention with formality, and they arranged for prisoners to work in farms and mills where they would watch output that ran through the night. They let local newspapers arrive in the camp library. They allowed church groups to send holiday packages. They contracted with companies to supply camp canteens with standard goods at fixed prices. In this system, a brown bottle with a white script was not an instrument of a ministry. It was an ordinary comfort that rode in the back of a truck with the bread and the cigarettes and the soap, and it was so normal that no guard bothered to explain it. The explanation waited in the number of trains that passed the town each day, the number of tankers that flowed through pipelines to coastal depots, and the number of aircraft that rolled off lines at Willow Run, and other plants that lit the night when shift whistles blew. The meaning of the bottle was the size of the network behind it. When Karl looked at that network, he began to understand that no propaganda could fit such a thing inside a label. He learned in the first week to walk from the barrack to the yard at roll call without looking down. He learned which guard spoke German like a man from Hamburg, and which spoke the clipped English of a southern state. He learned the angle of the morning sun across the gravel and the timing of the kitchen clatter as breakfast was loaded into bins. On the third day, he took a work detail into the fields. The truck turned past storefronts with painted signs and stopped at a corner where a vending rack held bottles under a canvas shade. The driver bought two and handed one to the farmer who met the truck with a clipboard and a pencil tucked behind his ear. The farmer drank while he read the names. He did not look at the prisoners as if they were special. Later, when the sun had risen high and men worked with cotton sacks, a boy walked out with a bucket filled with ice and a half-circle of sweat on his shirt. He pulled out bottles and handed them to the driver and to the farmer. He looked at the prisoners and smiled, and then looked back at the house. No one offered prisoners a bottle in the field that day. No one mocked them with it either. In the truck on the way back to the camp, men began again to whisper about control and tricks, and one said the Americans put something in the drink to make workers keep time. Karl closed his eyes and pictured the plant that had to chill the bottles, and the ice that had to be made, and the clean water that had to run, and the coal that had to arrive to fire the boilers at a power station. He held the story about a trick in one hand and the picture of a network in the other. The network weighed more. The overview of this small workday was the approach of a larger tide. In July, transports would bring more prisoners to ports on the Atlantic and Gulf coasts as Allied plans tightened for landings in Europe. In August, trains would carry thousands of men across the same platforms in a smooth routine. By autumn, the harvest would set new labor demands, and American farmers would file more requests for prisoner details. The War Department would keep a simple ledger of labor hours and would credit a wage to a prisoner account and hand a portion in canteen scrip each week. In classrooms that fall, instructors would hand out readers that explained the structure of the government and the idea that a business could operate at scale because courts enforced contracts, and because power lines reached into every town, and because taxes built roads that carried goods. Bored men would take the classes for something to do and then argue in the yard about sentences in the readers. The arguments would cool as the evidence mounted around them. One kept hearing that the drink was a trick. Another kept seeing that if it was a trick, then the entire country had joined in it. And if the entire country had joined in it, then that was the evidence that mattered. The label did not need a stamp from an office. The bottle moved anyway. Karl woke before dawn on 7th of June 1943 at Camp Hearn and listened to the first sounds of the kitchen. Pans scraped, lids clattered, and voices carried over the packed earthyard in a calm rhythm he did not yet trust. He pulled on his jacket and felt for the small diary stitched into the lining and then stood in line with the others as the door opened and a guard with a clipboard called numbers. The mess hall was bright with electric light that did not flicker. The milk was cold again. The bread was soft and fresh. On a side table stood the same tubs of ice melting down into white fog, and in them the same bottles with the curved script on the labels. He did not reach for one at once. He tried to feel angry, and he could not. He remembered the station platform in Mexia, and the boy on the bicycle and the smell of syrup and glass, and he felt again the old idea that such a drink in such quantity must be a plan from the state, a trick to soften men and to create the feeling that resources had no limit. He remembered the mutter in the truck that the Americans used the drink to control time and attention. He took a bottle anyway because the guard nodded at the tubs and said that they were for prisoners as well. He drank and tasted the same spark. He studied the guard as he drank. The guard was young and had an easy manner. Karl asked in simple English where the bottles came from. The guard pointed his thumb toward town and said the plant was only a short distance away. He said a name that sounded like Woodruff and added that the head of the company had promised the army that soldiers would get the drink whenever they wore a uniform for a nickel wherever they served. The name meant nothing to Karl at that moment. The promise seemed to support his fear that the drink was a policy and not a private good. Yet the guard said it with the casual tone of a man reciting a slogan from a shop window. He did not sound like a state official. He sounded like a worker repeating a line that made sense in a world where supply lines worked as if by natural law. Karl put the empty bottle in the crate and watched a prisoner carry the crate to a corner where other empties waited. He wondered how many bottles a plant could fill in a day. He wondered how many trucks loaded them and how many stops they made. He looked at the ice again and felt the old country very far away. The wider world that explained that morning lay in decisions already made in Washington and in Atlanta months before Karl reached Texas. In 1942 and 1943, the Army Service Forces managed food, fuel, clothing, tools, and recreation for millions of men across theaters and bases. Officers in the Quartermaster Corps counted rations in the language of carloads and shipholds, and they allowed soft drink bottlers to erect small plants near camps and ports, so that a familiar product could follow soldiers into training camps and staging areas. Robert Woodruff, the leader of the company that owned the brand, told his board that every man in uniform should have a bottle for 5 cents wherever he was, and he worked with the War Department to place portable bottling units near large bases and later near fronts overseas so that supply officers could contract for deliveries without using too much space on ships. The arrangement was not the work of an office that invented a drink. It was a pact that let a private firm ride along with public logistics, a pact that made sense because sugar quotas, bottle supplies, and truck routes could be managed inside the same schedules that moved rations and boots. By 1943, bottlers in the United States still served civilians, though with smaller quotas, while new units followed troops to North Africa, to Sicily in July, and then to Italy and beyond, and millions of bottles were poured into canteens each week. The promise that the Guard repeated was a business promise backed by a relationship with the Army. To a man from a country where the party had long ruled prices and ration cards, it sounded like a public decree. In truth, it was a private boast woven into a system where public and private both drew power from a river of coal, oil, wire, rail, and labor organized at a national scale. Statistics partly hidden from a prisoner made the shape of that river clear to anyone who looked at the docks. Steel production in the United States in 1943 would top 80 million tons. Aircraft production would pass 85,000 planes. The number of freight cars in daily use would stay near 2 million. The number of long-distance telephone calls that stitched the country together would reach levels that engineers in Europe could only imagine. A bottle of a sweet drink was not a government charm. It was a passenger in a machine that could deliver food, mail, and men on time across a continent and then across oceans. The confusion among prisoners came from the shock of seeing a private label alive and healthy while their own country had stripped shop windows blank. The confusion would not last for those who worked and watched. Work began for Karl 1 week after arrival. On the 14th June, a guard called his name for a detail sent to a cotton gin outside of Herne that needed extra hands to clear lint and to stack bales after the machinery ran. He climbed into a truck with 12 others and rode past fields where rows ran straight and long and where tractors moved with steady speed that held no drama and no breakdowns. The gin building was a great wooden hall with a corrugated roof and a belt of dust around it that tasted dry on the tongue. Inside, belts and rollers thumped and sang, and the floor shook under his boots. The owner took off his hat and greeted the guard with a handshake and a quick wave, and then motioned the prisoners to a side door, where a foreman explained tasks in simple words and signals. By mid-morning, Karl had fallen into a rhythm that left little room for thought. The smell of oil and fiber was everywhere. The lint rose and stuck to sweat. The noise was a wall. At noon, the foreman waved the crew outside. A boy came from the house with a wooden crate of bottles packed in ice so cold that steam rose in the heat. The foreman took one, and the guard took one, and the boy took one. The men from the gin took their turns. No one looked at the prisoners when the crate came. No one grinned in triumph or contempt. There was no show. There was a familiar act done without thought, as if the entire country knew the same small habit. The boy set the empty rack into the back of a truck and carried a full rack into the shade, and then went back toward the house. The foreman checked his watch and wiped his hands. The guard looked at Karl and shrugged as if to say that this was the way of things. Karl drank water and watched the ice melt into the dust. He remembered that the guard in the mess had said 5 cents. He tried to picture how many bottles sat in the racks of the town. He tried to picture how far those racks reached in a country this size. Later in the afternoon, a flat truck with bales pulled away toward the rail siding, and he watched the driver turn with a small upgrade of the engine noise and watched dust lift and settle in the heat. At the siding stood a line of cars waiting for a locomotive. The foreman said the cotton would travel to Galveston, and then by ship to Eastern Mills, or travel north toward Dallas and beyond. Every path looked smooth. Every path looked planned. Nothing about it reminded him of a party office or a propaganda plan. Everything about it felt like a habit built over years and years, until men behaved as if lines and timetables had always existed. The numbers behind that quiet day can be read in records that were not written for prisoners, but that shaped their hours. Rural electrification in Texas had reached about 9 out of 10 farms by 1943 because the state and federal programs that pushed wires into the countryside had combined with private co-ops to string lines over rivers and across pastures. The Colorado River Authority and other projects sent power to pumps and motors that turned gins and drove saws. The rail lines that cross-hatched the state had been graded and laid decades earlier, and now carried wartime loads with dispatchers measuring minutes and crews working with a discipline that matched factories. The prisoner of war program tracked hours and paid a small wage that the Army checked with simple arithmetic, done by clerks who had learned their figures in town schools. Figures for the whole country. That summer were large and growing larger. By midsummer, more than 100 main camps and hundreds of branch camps took in men like Karl and sent them back out each day to farms, mills, and plants where they could watch the hidden order of wires, belts, and timetables. In many places, they saw the same bottle again and again. The repetition created a story inside the camps that men carried like a rumor at first. Some said the government in Washington owned the company. Some said the Office of War Information used the drink to shape minds. Some said the sugar was not sugar at all. A clerk at Camp Hearn who had good English explained that the company was private and pointed to the way money changed hands at the canteen and at the plant gate. He quoted a line from a newspaper about portable bottling units built for overseas that would follow the Army as far as North Africa, and then to Sicily in July, and then to Italy in September, and how the company had pledged to stand the costs of units that would be needed. He said the Army let them through because the drink helped morale, and because the cost in ship space and time was small compared with the gain in spirits among men who were far from home. To many prisoners, this sounded like a trick inside a trick. They had learned to listen for the voice of the state behind any public event. For Karl, the words mixed with the scene he saw with his eyes. The boy with the crate at the gin did not look like an instrument of a ministry. The crate looked like a thing that moved every day in the same schedule, and the boy looked like he had done the same errand since he was old enough to carry glass. On the last Sunday of June, a chaplain from a local church led a short service outside the fence, and a small choir sang a hymn in German, and American families who had sons overseas sent cakes and cookies to the guardhouse for distribution. After the service, a group of prisoners who had permission to play on the camp football ground squared off against a team of guards and civilian workers. The teams laughed and argued over calls and kicked dust into the hot light. On the sideline, a crate of bottles stood in the shade. At a pause, a worker flipped the caps on 3 bottles and handed one to a guard and one to a player in a prisoner shirt and took one for himself. The act had no ceremony or apology. It was the same as the act at the gin. Over time, a pattern like this removes the need for a speech. It becomes proof that does not need a speaker. In the evening, the camp library opened, and Karl sat at a table with a book of English phrases and a small reader that explained how a town council functioned and how a state legislature was elected. He read slow, mouthing words, and he paused at the part that explained the flow of money between taxes and services. He thought of the roads. He thought of the ice. He thought of the crates. He closed the book and wrote 3 lines in the diary about the day. He did not write about the drink. He thought that the memory of the crate on the sideline would serve him better than any sentence he could write about it. In the bunk above him, a man read out loud from a letter that said the writer had worked that week in a cannery in another county and had seen machines fill and seal tins without long lines of workers, watched one woman throw a switch to start a bank of steam cookers, saw a manager check gauges and then step away to drink coffee. The man said he had seen racks of bottles near the door at the break and that the workers bought them without a thought. Men in the room grumbled about tricks and plans and hidden hands. Karl listened and said nothing. He had learned in a few weeks that numbers mattered more than speeches, and that repetition was a number too. The count of a thing that appears again and again until it rises above doubt. The broader history that pressed in on that quiet Sunday was moving faster than any prisoner could grasp while inside a fence. On 9th July 1943, Allied troops went ashore in Sicily in a vast landing that used more than 3,000 ships and craft supported by more than 4,000 aircraft. Supplies for that action rolled through docks in Norfolk and other ports in a river of crates and barrels and vehicles that made Mexia a small point on a map. In that river sat pallet loads of bottled drinks for troop canteens, packed by the same franchise network that sent crates to towns in Texas. By September, troops would be in Italy. By November, aircraft were lifting out of fields in Britain in larger and larger numbers under a plan to break the industrial base of the Reich. In each of these movements, the army kept morale in mind. Ice cream was served on some ships. Music played in tents. Letters moved in bags that clogged tables in military postal stations until clerks pulled them apart and sent them forward as fast as trains could carry them. Alongside these comforts stood the statistics that shook prisoners when they began to sink into minds that had grown on ration cards and blackout nights. The Willow Run plant near Detroit reached a pace of a bomber per hour. The Gulf Coast sent out tankers with fuel refined in plants that ran day and coast night. Railroads carried food and coal in volumes that topped many European national totals for the pre-war years. In such a world, a bottle of sweet soda for soldiers and prisoners was a footnote. Yet it was a footnote that men saw and touched, and it changed minds faster than shouting would have done. In early July, Karl drew a detail to the rail yard at Hearn, where grain cars were lined up like rows of schoolboys getting measured. The air was hot and smelled of wheat dust and creosote. He joined 2 guards and 6 prisoners in sweeping spillage into bins and in checking lids against a list when wagons were moved. The yardmaster was a thin man with a sharp voice and a pocket watch and a habit of touching a pencil to his tongue before making a mark. He did not look at prisoners any more than he looked at the ballast under his feet. He cared about cars and couplings and times. A string of cars rattled past behind a small switch engine, and on the track beyond a freight train pulled through with reefers at the head end and tank cars in the middle and a long tail of box cars. Karl counted tank cars and then gave up at 16 when he had to step aside for a foreman. At noon, a woman from a small cafe near the yard came to the gate with a tray covered in cloth. The guard bought sandwiches, and a group of workers bought bottles from a wooden rack she carried in her other hand. A yard worker opened a bottle and handed it to the woman, and she laughed and shook her head and passed it to a man near her and reached for another to hand to a guard. Karl felt a pang of thirst and then swallowed it. He had had water, and that would do. He watched the bottles disappear and the empty rack take their place on the ground at the workers' feet. When he returned to the barracks that evening, he wrote in the diary that the most American thing he had seen that day was not a bottle or a locomotive. It was the woman who carried a tray and a rack and sold lunch to workers without a worry about payment, because the guard and the yardmaster and the men all knew the price and had the coins in their pockets. The figures that frame a rail yard like that one in the summer of 1943 stagger any person raised in a small town in Europe. The number of freight cars loaded and unloaded in a single day across all yards in the United States rose past 100,000 in busy weeks. The coal that moved from mines in Pennsylvania and West Virginia to steel plants in Ohio and Indiana and to power stations in many states was measured in millions of tons per month. Grain moved from Kansas and Nebraska to mills and ports in strings of cars that reached mile after mile. The telegraph lines that hung beside the tracks carried messages that kept this flow in time. The yards broke up and made up trains with switch crews that moved like machines. These crews drank coffee in the morning and soda in the heat, and never wondered whether the government had ordered both into their hands. The government ordered steel and coal and shells by the trainload, and it fixed prices for many things, and it rationed tires and gas and sugar. But it did not need to invent a drink in a bottle, and it did not need to use it as a charm. For a man like Karl, the lesson came quietly. He began to place the bottle in the same mental shelf where he placed bread and milk and newspapers. He saw that it existed because a private network sat on a public base of roads, rails, and power. He saw that the reason it showed up everywhere was not a secret order. It was a web of contracts and deliveries that could run even while the country sent millions of men overseas and built weapons on a scale the world had never seen. This understanding did not make him like the drink, more or less. It made him look for the network behind each site. It made him ask himself how an army can cross an ocean with tanks and planes and then keep them running. It made him think about engines in trucks and about spare parts. It made him understand that slogans about spirit and race look thin when you stand in a rail yard and watch one train after another pass with the same precise intervals. On 20 July, the camp posted notices for classes under the Special Projects Division program. The sign explained that prisoners could study English, arithmetic, geography, and a course in civics that used a small book with simple pictures and text. Karl signed for English and for civics because he wanted new words and because he wanted to test the claims he had heard about how this country worked. In the first civics lesson, the instructor, a young man in spectacles who had been a school teacher before the war, drew a simple map of the town on the board. He drew the depot, the main street, the water tower, the power lines, the school, the church, the cotton gin, the bottling plant, and the camp. He drew arrows to show how money moved from wages to shops, from taxes to services, from contracts to deliveries. He showed how private and public fit together like pieces of a puzzle. He said that this fit did not make everything fair or easy, and that men argued in newspapers and elections about how much should be public and how much private. He said that at war the argument still went on, even while men fought and died far away, because the habit of argument was part of the strength of the country. The class sat quiet. Some men smirked, some frowned. One asked if the government ordered the company to supply the drink. The teacher smiled and said no, that the company had pushed to serve soldiers and that the army had allowed it because the effect on morale was good and the cost small. He said that the proof was that not one official had to force a worker to drink. The men drank because they wanted to. Karl copied the picture of the map into his notebook. He added the rail yard and the cotton fields and the cannery that a friend had described. He added the ice plant. He drew a line from the ice plant to the camp, kitchen, and to the bottling plant, and to the cafe at the yard. He stopped and looked at the web and saw that some lines were fat and some thin. He told himself that the fat lines were the ones that ran without break, and that the thin lines were the ones that could be cut with less damage. He saw that the bottle rode on the fat lines. He closed the notebook and felt a kind of peace he had not felt since Tunisia. It was not the peace of victory. It was the peace of understanding a small part of a large machine. The large machine moved again in August. News filtered into camp about the fall of the government in Rome and about German forces moving to hold positions in Italy. Rumors spread that more prisoners would arrive from North Africa and from Sicily as operations continued. Trucks came and went from the camp with faster tempo as farms demanded labor. On a hot afternoon, Karl worked at a grain elevator in a town a few miles from Herne, where a line of trucks dumped wheat into a pit that fed a tall conveyor that rattled grain up into bins that sang softly as they filled. The operator sat on a stool and watched a cluster of gauges and ate a sandwich with meat thick enough to make Karl look away for a moment. On a bench nearby stood 2 empty bottles and 1 full. He watched as the operator reached for the full one, cracked the cap, and took a long drink, set it down, and returned to the gauges. There was nothing dramatic to see. There was only a line of trucks and a belt that did not stop, and a small act that had no relation to the passing of an order in an office. That night in the barrack, a man said again that the drink was a conspiracy. Karl answered for the first time that it was proof of something else. He said it was proof that a country can be rich and at war at the same time if it has built the right lines. He said it was proof that men in towns can have small comforts, while soldiers fight overseas if makers and movers can keep time. He said a conspiracy would not need a rail yard that worked minute by minute. It would only need posters and a loud voice. He said he had seen the yard. The men in the room fell quiet. One snorted and rolled over. Another stared at the ceiling. The argument did not end that night. It moved forward with the days. Karl woke to the sound of rain on the tin roof in the first week of August, and for a moment thought of the slate roofs of the Ruhr and the way water slides to the gutter and drums in the downspout. The camp roofs sang in a deeper register. He rose with the others, folded his blanket square, and moved into the line. The air held the clean smell of wet earth and wood. In the mess, the lamps glowed without a flicker, though the sky outside had turned a flat gray. He took coffee and bread and watched the tubs of ice breathe white fog in the damp air. A guard waved him over to a notice where his number was written, beside a work detail for the rail siding north of town. He felt a familiar knot in his stomach, ease a little. Work had made the days pass. On the truck, he sat with men who had begun to speak less about captures and more about small details of American life. One asked if anyone had learned the word for the machine that lifted grain to the top of the elevator. Another asked why the ice in the tubs seemed endless in a summer like this. The guard listened without comment. When they reached the siding, the foreman pointed them to a row of boxcars and showed with his hands what needed to be moved and swept and checked. By mid-morning, Karl had fallen into the old habit of counting. He counted the cars in the train that rolled through on the next track. He counted the steps between the switch stand and the point where the rails met. He counted the trucks lined up at a small cafe and store at the edge of the yard. When he went to the pail for water, he passed a wooden crate set under the store awning and saw again the brown glass and the curved letters on the labels. Two railroad men leaned on the counter and talked about a schedule board posted inside, and one took a bottle from the ice with the same absent motion as a man checks his watch. Karl felt again the old resistance. He thought of the stories that the drink existed because the government wished to put a sign in every hand to show prisoners a power that might not be real. Yet the rain slackened, and the sun pressed through the cloud in a pale coin of light, and the work went on, and no one looked at the bottles as if they were a message. The men used them the way men use tools or gloves. In the afternoon, the foreman passed a newspaper to the guard while they waited for a switch engine, and Karl read an item about a baseball team from a nearby city and an advertisement that promised 5 cents for the familiar drink at all fountains and stands. The line felt like a memory from the years before war. It did not feel like a decree. He tucked the newspaper away in his mind and returned to the broom. The figures and the history behind that small morning at the siding ran like a river beyond the sight of any one worker. American railroads in 1943 moved freight in daily totals counted in hundreds of thousands of carloads. Coal shipments poured from Appalachian mines to steel furnaces in the Middle States, and to powerhouses that kept camps and factories lit, even when storms moved over the plains. Grain rose in an inland tide from elevators in Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas, and flowed toward mills and ports where ships waited in their berths. The Office of Defense Transportation timed priority trains to the minute, while private railroads kept dispatchers at boards that looked like cloth maps wired to the nation with small lights. The War Production Board rationed tires and gas and sugar, but it built its rules on a base of private companies that already knew how to move goods by contract and timetable. Robert Woodruff, the leader of the Atlanta company that put the name on the bottles Karl kept, seeing, had told his board 2 years earlier that every man in uniform should have a bottle for 5 cents wherever he was. That pledge was not a law. It was a decision to ride along with the Army and to place portable bottling units near training camps and later near docks and airfields. In the same months, the Special Projects Division inside the office of the Provost Marshal General designed classes and newspapers for camps to blunt the hold of Nazi teaching with facts and with daily examples of a different order of life. When German prisoners saw the drink on every siding and at every stand, they often turned at first to the suspicion that the state had drawn a circle around the brand and made it a sign. What they were seeing was something else that had grown over half a century. It was the web of franchise bottlers, glass plants, ice houses, sugar refineries, and delivery routes that moved without show because the habits were old. The rain that drummed on the tin roof that morning was the storm of a humid Texas summer. The steady light in the mess was the work of a grid that rarely failed. The crate under the awning was not a charm. It was a small piece of the same web that had sent Liberty ships out of yards by the thousands, and trucks onto roads by the millions, and bombers off assembly lines in the tens of thousands. In such a country, a sweet drink could be both ordinary and everywhere without a ministry printing orders. 3 days later, he went out with a farm crew west of Hearn, where the fields ran wide and the road met the horizon in a thin line. The sun stood hard and bright, and air shimmered above the furrows. The farmer met the truck at the gate and spoke to the guard about rows to cut and sacks to fill. Karl bent to the work with the old soldier care that saved the back and the hands. He fell into a rhythm that left room for thoughts to rise and pass. He remembered the diary page he had written about ice and about the sense that repetition was a kind of proof. Near noon, a young woman came from the farmhouse with a basket and a pail and set them on a shaded bench by a wall. Workers gathered. The pail held water. The basket held food wrapped in paper. On the bench, a rack of bottles leaned in a small shine of ice. The farmer took one. The driver took one. A worker lifted another and opened it with a pocket opener. A breeze moved across the yard and lifted the edge of the wrapper on a sandwich. The young woman set the empty rack aside and called something back to the house. No one glanced toward the prisoners except to wave them to the water pail. Karl drank deep and cool and watched the small scene the way he had watched a battery change in Tunisia. He knew how much power lay in a routine. He saw that the box and the bottles and the opener and the way the caps fell in a ring on the table were learned motions that preceded war and would outlast it. In the field after the break, he worked a long row and counted the cuts he made and watched shadows slide. The guard walked the edge of the plot and stopped to talk with the farmer now and then. When the truck rolled back to the camp in the late light, he wrote in his diary that the real lesson of the bottle was not sweetness or a slogan. It was the size of the path that brought it here on this day without fanfare. He wrote that if a nation could spare ice for a farm bench in August, it could also spare fuel for a bomber and rations for a ship crew and parts for a truck. He stopped and put a line under the word path. In the barrack that night, he read a page from the small civics book about how a town council paid for water pipes and roads, and how a state built a bridge that a company did not want to build because the bridge served everyone, and not only a few. The words were plain. He matched them with the picture in his head of the bench and the rack and the way the caps fell. He slept without dreams.